Have you ever read a book when you were a kid and you thought it was about one thing? And then maybe you're an adult and you're reading it to your kid and you realize it was about something entirely different that just went way over your head as a kid? Maybe you've seen Disney Pixar movies that, like, some of the jokes are a little coarse, but they go way over the head of a little kid. But when you're an adult, no, you get what they're trying to say. The Cat in the Hat is one of my favorite books as a kid. I loved this book because as a kid, this book is about getting away with stuff. It really is. You know, and as you start this, and there's two kids, the narrator and his sister named Sally, and they're home alone. And when two siblings are home alone, I have an older brother, we were home alone a lot, we know that's a recipe for trouble. Now, a lot of times when it's nice outside, you can go get in trouble outside. But on this particular day, it's raining. It says, the sun did not shine, it was too wet to play, so we sat in the house all that cold, cold, wet day. I sat there with Sally, we sat there, we two, and I said how I wish we had something to do. Boredom. Boredom is always the precursor to insanity. It's when things really get bad. And then all of a sudden, a cat, not one of the meow cats, but this cat in a striped hat shows up, and he offers these two kids something to do. They're bored out of their minds, so they welcome him in. I'm just going to ruin the story. The Cat in the Hat is the devil. Just the reality. He comes in and he offers them temptation. What do you want to do? And for a little while, they have some fun. It's just kind of mischievous fun. Nothing really crazy. He balances some stuff on his head. Ironically enough, there's a fish in this picture that can talk. And he tells them, no, the cat needs to go out. The fish knows what's going on, but the kids don't. And they're like, a talking cat? Fun. Let's see where this leads us. And after a while, the cat just kind of continues to mess things up, pile stuff high, and then all of a sudden everything goes down in a crash. And the kids are like, whoa, what are we going to do? It's, a mess in here now. They're like, we should probably clean up. But no, the cat runs out of the door. And he goes and he says, I have something else that we can do. And he brings in a box. He says, I have another good game that I know. And then he ran out, and then as fast as a fox, the Cat in the Hat came back with a box. A big red wood box. It was shut with a hook. Now look at this trick, said the cat. Take a look. Then he got up on top with the tip of his hat. I call this game Fun in a Box, said the Cat in the Hat. In this box are two things I will show to you now. You will like these two things, he said with a bow. I will pick up the hook. You will see something new, two things, and I call them Thing 1 and Thing 2. These things will not bite you. They want to have fun. Then out of the box came Thing 2 and Thing 1. And they ran to us fast. They said, how do you do? Would you like to shake hands with Thing 1 and Thing 2? And if you know the rest of the story, you know Thing 1 and Thing 2, like a tornado, go through the entire house and destroy everything. And the kids are having fun, and I think it probably was fun. They couldn't go outside in rain, so let's just destroy the house. If you're a young person, parents are out, that's kind of the way it goes. But then, things get serious. Consequences are on the horizon. Mom is coming home. What do? The house is a mess. Well, now they go into serious mode. Now they go into, okay, we have to clean up the mess. And surprisingly, right in the nick of time, they get the house cleaned up. It is completely clean. The cat's gone. The two things are gone. And Mom walks into the house, unbeknownst to her. And it ends with this. The story ends with a question. It says that our mother came in and she said to us two, did you have any fun? Tell me, what did you do? And Sally and I did not know what to say. Should we tell her the things that went on there that day? Should we tell her about it? Now what should we do? Well, what would you do if your mother asked you? They got away with it. They got away with a messy house. They had a lot of fun. I had an older brother. We had a lot of days like this where we destroyed the house. Reality tells me that most of the time, you get caught. And I'm gonna actually, when I was reading this last night, I I realized one thing. What would you do if your mother asked you? Mothers are psychic. That mom already knew what happened that day. She's waiting to see whether or not they're going to fess up. That is the question. What do you do when something like this happens in your life? What will you do? You see, we have thing one and thing two, and they come like a tornado in the house and they destroy everything. But they have an annoying older brother that I'm not sure if you ever met. Thing three is the one that comes in and asks, okay, well, what are you going to do now? Are you going to fess up to what happened there that day, or are you just going to pretend like you got away with it? Mom already knows. You may be scanning the room like, oh, what's out of place? Mom's going to find out. She already knows. Are you going to fess up with it? What are you going to do with what happened that day? We have to talk about the experiences that we have in our lives. We have to tell people about them. Why do we have to tell people about them? Well, this is what I'm talking about today. The experiences that we have in life that change us, the experiences that we go through, can provide living examples to other people that can help change their lives too. Today we're going to talk about the ABCs. Now you may remember the ABCs from when you were in elementary school. You had to learn the ABCs. Maybe you learned a song that sounds surprisingly a lot like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The ABCs are the foundation for everything else we're going to learn in school, in life. If you don't know the ABCs, you can't read. And if you can't read, there's not much else that you can do. Everything in school is based on the ABCs. But for us today, they have a special meaning. You see, in churches, we've taken the ABCs and maybe you've taught VBS or gone to VBS, and there's kind of a simple 3-phrase way that we tell children about Jesus. The ABCs, you might know them. Admit, believe, confess. Now, what you might not realize is that the ABCs of the Christian faith actually apply to a lot more than just telling somebody about Jesus. In fact, they pretty much apply to every other thing that we face in our lives. Admitting something. Do you realize that you are not perfect? I am not perfect. And sometimes it helps to admit that. To admit when you make a mistake. To admit when you need help. We are all going to face things in life where we need help. We're going to get to a point in our lives where we need help. The question is, will we admit it? And I'm not talking about admitting it to other people. I'm talking about admitting it to yourself. You know, a lot of times in life we believe we just have to get on our own. We have to push forward, work harder. Never admit weakness. Never admit that you made a mistake. Never admit that you need help. Why? Because we think that if we admit it, people will think less of ourselves. And if we admit it to ourselves, we're admitting that we can't do everything on our own. We have to admit that we're not perfect. We have to admit that we make mistakes. We have to admit that we need help. There's some other things that we need to admit. We bring this back to the church. What about God? What about God? For skeptics, they look at the world and somehow they come to the conclusion there is no God. Yet if you look at the vastness of the universe, when you look at all of the planets that we have found, all of the star systems that we have found, there are skeptics that are more ready to admit that there's probably alien life out there than they are to admit that there is an all-powerful God. When you look at a bumblebee is just this weird kind of blob with wings that flies. Have you ever looked at that and think, there is no way a bumblebee should be able to fly? What about man? What about human beings? Why are we so special? Why is it that humans became the ones who built cities, who built who decided that it would be a good idea to cut down a tree and build a house to live in? Why not other animals? What is it about us that is special? Have you ever thought about that? Now, if the evidence points to God, and I'm talking about not a higher being, I'm talking about the Christian God, the God who reveals himself in Scripture. If the evidence points to that, last week we talked about Jesus, and the evidence points that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. If the evidence points to that, are you willing to admit it? Or will you just continue to fake it, pretend? For us, admitting something is the hardest part. For me, to admit something is terrifying because it means that I'm probably going to go down a notch in a couple people's ideas, to make a mistake. I believe and have been deceived to believe I have to be perfect. That's why the second letter is believe. What you believe is the most important thing about you. It says everything about you. What you believe is going to dictate the way that you live your life. If you believe that you have to be perfect, that you can't make a mistake, if you believe that your value is based on something, that's where you're going to put your effort. The problem is, what happens when your reality doesn't measure up to what you believe? Imagine you believe that you have to be perfect at work or else you're going to lose your job. So you put all of your effort into being perfect. But what happens when you make a mistake? Are you willing to admit it? Or are you going to fake it? Are you going to continue to fake it? Faking it is a hard work. But we have to believe that there is a better way. We have to believe that actually being truthful will set us free. And that there will be people who understand. I've kind of come to the conclusion that most people do not expect you to be perfect. It is you that expects you to be perfect. Other people will accept that you are going to make mistakes. Why? Because they're going to make mistakes. They can empathize with that. There is a better way. So what is it that you believe? What is it about yourself that you believe? Do you believe it's okay to make a mistake? But what are you going to believe in? If you believe in yourself, and that's all you believe in, well, that's called pride. If you believe all of that, then you believe that you have to fake it. That's going to ruin all of your relationships. It's going to ruin your relationships at work. People are going to think, man, he is just so prideful, arrogant. At home, if you always have to get the last word with your spouse, if you always have to put the foot down. If you remember a couple weeks ago, Pastor Bill talked about putting the foot down. If you think that, it's going to ruin your kids. It affects our relationships when all we can do is believe in ourselves. But what if I told you there was something that we could believe in that was bigger than ourselves? There was somebody who that when we did make those mistakes and we saw that mom was coming home and we got to clean up, we got to get right. What if there was somebody that could help us do that? Jesus came into this world to clean up our messes, not wait for us to clean them up ourselves. But it starts with admitting it to yourself, that you need help, so that you can ask for it. And then believing that Jesus is not waiting to hit you with a lightning bolt for the mistakes you've made, but waiting to welcome you in, to help fix you. But this can be traumatic. It's a traumatic experience when we have to admit to ourselves that we are not perfect, when we make mistakes. But we have to make a decision about what we're going to believe in. Are we going to believe in ourselves, or are we going to believe in something else? Are we going to believe that there is a better way? And that's where confessing comes into play. Confessing asks the question, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with the experiences that you've had? Are you going to admit it? What's the difference between confessing and admitting? Well, admitting is all about admitting to yourself. Maybe it's admitting to other people, but confessing is about doing something about it. And it starts with admitting out loud, saying it out loud. When it comes to our relationship with Jesus, Romans 10:9, Paul, who we're going to get to in a minute about his life, he tells us something very important. I've always kind of struggled with this. He says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, I've always struggled with this confess with your mouth idea. Why do we have to say it out loud? Why can't I just, it's a personal thing. I accept Jesus into my heart. I'm going to live that way, and it's going to be great. But why do I have to tell anybody? Why do I have to make it public? Why do I have to get baptized? Can't it just be personal? Why is it that we have to confess? Well, confession isn't what saves you. It isn't what, you don't get forgiveness from confession. Confession is a constant reminder to yourself of what you've admitted and what you believe in. Confession is a constant reminder. Admit and believe are a lot like thing one and thing two. They're the easy parts, really. Sometimes they're even fun. If you remember that first time you gave your life to Christ, it was awesome. You got emotional, and maybe you cried, and it was like, this is great. And then you believe in your heart, and you say, this is what I'm going to go forward with my life and do. But each and every day, the hardest part that we have to do is this idea of living a life that shows our confession. When Jesus came to the earth 2,000 years ago, he came into a world of people, the Pharisees, the Jewish people, who believed a lot of the right things. They believed in the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They believed in all of these they believed that the Old Testament was the Word of God. They tried their hardest to live up to that. But they had a belief that was wrong, and that belief was that they had to be perfect. The Old Testament contains 600 rules. We kind of summarized them down to 10 commandments, but there's 600 of them, 613, I think. Some people add even more. What they did with that was they were so concerned about being perfect and not breaking one of those 600, so what did they do? They added another 3,000. You think, man, I just filed my taxes this past week, and I'm thinking about all of the tax laws that I am supposed to follow, and I have no idea about most of those. So what do? I go and I hire a tax accountant because I have no idea anything about what I'm supposed to be following. I don't want to inadvertently break one of those. The Jewish people at that time were made to believe they had to be perfect or else God was going to judge them. So they spent so much time trying to follow these rules that guess what? They couldn't. And that was kind of the point. When you can't follow the rules, the idea was that they would cry out to God. But what did they do? Instead of admitting that they couldn't and believing in a God that would help them, they faked it. So when Jesus comes along, he comes into this world like this, and he's like, this is not what I meant. This is not what you were supposed to be doing. He says, and he boils it all down to one thing. In John 13, 34 through 35, Jesus says, a new command, he's talking to his disciples, those who are following him. He says, a new command I give to you. This is something not necessarily new in that it's never been spoken, but it's new in a way that it has new meaning for them. A new command I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. You see, what Jesus did was he came in and he took their admission. They admitted that the Old Testament law was very hard to follow. And he gave them something new to believe in, himself. He says, everything that you've been taught, it's all about love. It's about loving God, but it's about loving one another. And when we do that as a church, as we do that, the disciples, it tells the world a little bit of something about Jesus. It tells them, number one, that we love God. It tells people that we love Jesus. It tells them that love binds us together. And three, it tells the world that we are his disciples. When people look at you, can they tell you're his disciples. Why? Is it because that you go to church? Or is it that you are a loving, compassionate person and that you treat other Christians with respect? It's not natural for us to love people that aren't necessarily our family. Something like that takes a major change in our lives. To put people that aren't biologically related before yourself, that is the type of change that can change the world. For the next couple weeks, where we are going to be anchored is in Philippians chapter 3. When we think about change in the New Testament, we think about somebody who changed and became something better, who had to admit some things, had to believe some new things, and then lead a life that was different from the one he'd been living. There's no better person to talk to us about that than Paul. Paul had a dramatic experience with Jesus. Paul lived his life a certain way, believing that he was doing the right thing. He believed that he was going after these Christians and persecuting them, putting them down, because he felt like they were doing what was wrong. And Paul was doing what was right. And he put all of his effort into living that way to make sure that he could silence those people that are messing with God and doing the wrong thing. How traumatic must it have been for a man like Paul, who had been raised to believe one thing, believing that he was doing the right thing, to all of a sudden coming to a point in his life where he realized, I have been making the biggest mistake over the last few years of my life. I couldn't be more wrong. We pick up the story in Philippians chapter 3, verse 4. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh being who you are, how you were born, your family, your friends, that's the flesh. Confidence in himself. I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day, like any good Jewish boy would have been. I'm of the people of Israel, God's chosen people, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness, under the law, blameless. Paul felt pretty good about himself. Paul felt like he had the best upbringing, the best schooling. He was great. People looked at him and they thought, man, this guy is great. Paul's admission that he was wrong, that he had lived a life that made a mistake, it wasn't a gradual thing. Some of us come to this gradually. We think like, oh yeah, like I'm doing this. Oh wait, I'll stop over time. It'll be this kind of gradual progression of learning until we get to the point like, okay, we realize we were wrong. For Paul, it was like a bat to the face. He's on the road to Damascus. He's going up there. He's going to grab some more Christians, drag them back, throw them before trial. And Jesus shows up in this bright, shining light. And Paul realizes in that moment, oh no, I'm in trouble. Because he realizes that he has been persecuting Jesus. Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? Why are you doing these things? Up until that moment, Paul thought he was doing the right thing. And all of a sudden, now he realizes, okay, I wasn't. And when you face somebody as powerful as Jesus, who is able to appear to you in this bright, shining light, my guess is Paul thought he was about to die. Paul came face to face with the perfection of Jesus, which shined light on his imperfection. Paul spent 3 days blind. He went into the city in Damascus and he fasted and prayed for those 3 days. And I have to think that those prayers probably sounded more like begging. Paul had spent so much time persecuting Jesus, persecuting the church. He spent all of this time trying to get rid of the church. And now he realizes that the one person that can actually help him is the very person that he has been persecuting. I think Paul had to think, I'm a goner. I think a lot of this might be like when, a kid makes a mistake at home, he does something bad, picks on a sister, and mom says, go to your room. And you go to your room, and what do you wait for? You wait for Dad to get home. Because you know that when Dad gets home, that's when things are really going to, be bad. For me, when that kind of thing happened, I would go to my room and I would hide under my bed or hide in my closet, and I would just think to myself, okay, I got to come up with a plan. I will negotiate. I will make, I'll make my punishment so much more than that's warranted. That way maybe Dad will come in and he'll realize I'm really, really sorry, and he'll actually make it lower, or even better, he'll realize I did the wrong thing, and I know it, and I'm sorry, and I'll never do it again, and he just let me off scot-free, right? That never happened. Dad always got home, and he always went with the harsher punishment. But I think Paul was in that room, and he was praying, and he was begging, and he thought, what could I possibly offer to Jesus that would allow him to overlook this? I'm a goner. And those 3 days, we're back to that 3 days. That wait, 3 days, must have been excruciating. Because you don't know when that 3 days is going to end. You don't know when that time's going to end. All of a sudden, God's going to come, and, it's kind of like when you're waiting for Dad to get home, and you look at the door, and then all of a sudden the door opens. Paul didn't know when that door was going to open. But after 3 days, he was forced to face Ananias. Paul didn't actually kill anybody, but he had some of Ananias' friends killed. Paul may have even known about Ananias. Paul sees Ananias coming. I don't know what he thought, but Ananias lays his hands on Paul. Paul receives his sight, but he also receives a mission. Pride makes it very difficult to admit anything. But when you're somebody like Paul, you face this point where you don't have a choice. You're busted. You're red-handed. You're on your way. You have papers in possession to arrest people, and Jesus comes. You are busted. Have you ever had that experience where you're just caught red-handed? Maybe, at work, you're, stealing office supplies and you get caught. Maybe you lie and you get caught in a lie. As kids, parents have a way of finding out. But you're caught red-handed. What are you going to do? You have a choice. You can admit it, fess up, face the consequences. I always found that a lot of times I just kind of made excuses. Oh, I didn't really do that. This isn't what it looks like. I'm just, or you run. You run away. Paul wasn't given that. He wasn't given the opportunity to do anything but to admit it. You see, Jesus didn't give any consequences. But in that moment, Paul had no alternative but to believe in Jesus. He had no alternative but to accept that he had done some pretty awful things and that he didn't know what was going to happen. But the cool thing about Jesus is he gives Paul a mission. He doesn't give him any consequences. He doesn't say, are you sorry? He doesn't say, go say 3 Hail Marys and then come back. He just says, all right, you've been doing this. Here's what I want you to do. And then with the same vigor, the same passion, the same zeal that Paul had used to persecute the church, now he was going to spend the rest of his life using that same passion, that same vigor to tell people about Jesus. It cost Paul everything in that moment. And he didn't care because he believed now in the right person. He believed in the right mission. He believed in the right things. If we continue, Philippians chapter 3, 7 through 11. Paul says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surprising worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him in the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may obtain the resurrection from the dead." Paul now believed the right thing. He believed in the right person. He believed in the right mission. But belief doesn't automatically mean you're going to do something about it. People say that they believe in Jesus every single day. But will that belief cause them to do something about it? If you really believe in Jesus, your life should reflect that. For Paul, it cost him everything. It cost Paul everything to follow Jesus because it's costly. In this country, we don't really think about that all that often. We don't really think about what it costs to give our lives to Jesus because when we become Christians, it usually doesn't cost us anything. Maybe a little embarrassment walking down the aisle and telling people, but the reality is most of us, it's just kind of okay here. In our country, it's culturally acceptable to give your life to Jesus, to get baptized. We're okay with that. There may come a time down the road where it doesn't, but for now, that's okay. But think about somebody who's raised in another country. Think about the Muslim world. For somebody living in Saudi Arabia to give themselves to Jesus, they might get disowned by their family, written out of the will, no inheritance, thrown out into the street. They might even get killed for it. Yet when I think about that, why is it that one of the fastest growing demographics of Christian converts is coming from the Muslim world? Thousands of Muslims are giving their lives to Jesus every single day. And it goes back to, well, you can give your life to Jesus, you can accept it, you can admit that you're a sinner, you can believe in Jesus, and then keep it to yourself, right? And then all of a sudden you'd be fine. But they can't keep it to themselves. Nobody had to tell Paul what to do. It wasn't like God said, all right, Paul, I want you to go on these missionary trips, plant these churches. I got a 7-book contract deal that I want you to write. Go and do all that. No, he just said, he gave him grace. And Paul did the rest. Paul just went out and immediately started sharing with people about Jesus. What's interesting is that in order to do that, Paul had to publicly confess some of the things that he'd done. Paul went out and he started telling people, well, I persecuted the church. I had people killed. Yes, I did all that. But I have experienced Jesus, and now I'm living my life to tell people about him. The disciples didn't immediately accept him. They thought, oh, this is a big trick. He's just trying to get in with us so that he can drag us all to prison. Good job, Paul, but we're not buying it. But Paul continued to do that. He continued to confess. He continued to say, I was wrong. He continued to tell people, I had an experience with Jesus. And the rest of his life was not about making up for what he had done, but it was living in light of what he currently believed. Eventually, his confession, the disciples believed it. And why did the disciples believe it? Because the very people that Paul used to be a part of were now trying to kill Paul as a result of what he was talking about. You see, with Paul, confession allowed the disciples to help him, but it cut him off from his past. It cut him off from ever being able to go back and be able to be a part of the Pharisee community. They wrote him off and they said, you're not welcome here anymore. Paul had to give up everything, but he had to confess it because confession frees us to act. Confession frees us to be able to move forward in our lives. Paul tells us, Philippians chapter 3, verse 12 through 14, not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it on my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul's confession freed him. The confession of what he'd experienced freed him. If he didn't experience that, if he didn't tell people about that, nobody would have accepted him. His confession freed him. It's one thing to admit that you make a mistake. It's one thing to believe that there's a better way. But it's another thing to talk about that experience. You see, Paul would come across a lot of people that had made a lot of mistakes in their lives. Some even Jewish who'd made the same mistakes that he'd made. Paul would go all the way up to Rome. And he would be able to witness to people and tell people in the household of Caesar about Jesus. Some people that had in them their own admission in the Roman army who were persecuting Christians. He'd be able to say, I used to be just like you. Why? Because our experiences become living examples that change other people. Experiences that change us. Paul was changed. He was able to use that. But for Paul, one thing remains. One thing remains for Paul, and it's not something that just happens once. It's not something that Paul just says, well, I did it once, and now I don't ever have to do it again. This one thing remained for Paul, and that it is forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. This one thing for Paul, leaving behind the past. He had to leave behind his life as a Pharisee. Pharisees were probably pretty wealthy. He had to give that all up. He had to give up his standing. He had to give up his position. He probably had to give up his family. But he was willing to leave all of that behind to follow Jesus. But there was one more thing Paul probably had to leave behind, that he constantly probably had to remind himself to leave behind, and that was his guilt. You see, Paul persecuted the church. People died because of the things that Paul did. Paul was forgiven by Jesus, and he had to let that guilt go. You see, sometimes we hold on to the guilt of the things that we've done in the past. It would have been easy for Paul to just say, I'm just going to continue to do, I'll earn my favor back with God. I will go and I will plant these churches. I will write all these books. My life will be about making up for the things that I did in the past. But Paul never said that. Paul always talked about the reason he did things was to bring glory to Jesus. One thing remains. When you have an experience in your life that changed you, what are you going to do with that? Maybe it's you've admitted something, that you made a mistake. You believe that by being open and honest about that mistake, that you'll find forgiveness. Maybe from God, but also maybe from a friend, a family member, a spouse. What will you do with those experiences? Admitting is easy. It's the easy part. I know sometimes we think that's the hard part. Believing, when you're face to face with the truth, it's pretty easy to believe the truth. But what will you do with that? How will your life be impacted by that? Will you just kind of let it kind of go, keep it to yourself, or will you allow yourself to talk about your experiences that you've had? What will you do? Well, if you come to faith in Jesus like Paul did, the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure you're believing the right thing. You need to make sure that you believe in the right things. Believe the right things about yourself. That it's okay to make a mistake, that it's okay to need help, that it's okay to not have all the answers. You need to believe the right thing. And second, we need to remember Jesus' command to his disciples in John 13. We need to love one another. As a church, we need to love one another. Why? Because how we treat one another tells the world an awful lot about Jesus. So when we say love one another, look around the world. We as a church, not just this church, but churches universally across the world, we don't treat one another very well. We actually put each other down a lot. Instead of seeing other Christians as people that need saviors. We actually, or people just like us who were sinners who've been saved, who should offer grace to others, we kind of see ourselves as kind of God's enforcers to go out and enforce his laws or enforce his rules, which is exactly what Paul was doing. And Jesus said, no, go and tell people about my love for them. And third, we need to have a passion to tell people about Jesus. Paul spent the rest of his life telling people about the experience he had so that others would have that same experience. If we've experienced that change where we've actually given our lives to Jesus and it's affected us, we should tell people about it. We should invite them to church. Today we have to admit some things. First, we have to admit some things to ourselves. Maybe there are some mistakes that we've made. Maybe there's some things about ourselves that we need to admit that maybe we don't like so much. Then you have to ask yourself, what do you believe about the things that you admit? Do you believe that it's okay to admit things? Do you believe that there's a better way than just trying to fake it? And then you have to ask yourself, what will we do with what we've experienced? What are you going to do? As we go into this time of reflection, I want you to begin to think about these three questions. What do you need to admit? Maybe to yourself to start. What do you believe about what you admit? And then what will these things cause you to do? That's personal. As you sit here and you reflect on that, think about that. But there's something else we need to go a little further. We as a church have a responsibility as well. And that's to create an environment where questions like this are okay. Where people who are hurting, who are broken, who've made mistakes, who aren't perfect, can be free to acknowledge that, who can be free to be transparent. Admitting and believing is one thing, but giving people the opportunity to live their confession is another. Paul, every single day for the rest of his life, probably reminded people and himself of the things that he'd done in the past, not because he was trying to make up for it, but so that people could see just how far you can come. Paul was able to use his experiences as living examples that changed other people. Even if sometimes you can look at Paul and say, well, at least I'm not as bad as him, at least I didn't do the things as him. That's probably not the most mature thing. But Paul, I think, would have been okay with it. He said, I am the chief of sinners. There is no way you are as bad as I was. If I can come to a saving knowledge of Jesus, then so can you. We as a church need to be a place where sinners are welcome. We need to be a place where people who don't believe they're a sinner are still welcome. We need to be a place where people can simply just come and be open, be honest, who can admit, who can learn what they should believe, who can be told the truth, and then be given an opportunity to confess. As we enter this time of reflection, this time of prayer, think about these questions. What do you need to admit? What do you believe about what you admit? And what will these things cause you to do? As you enter this time of prayer, as there's music in the background, you can come up front, you can pray, you can admit them to God. Probably not the best time to go and admit them to somebody in the room, but think about something for that later. But as you go to God in prayer, believe that He is ready to receive you, that He's not waiting with lightning bolts to come and smash you when you admit that you've done something wrong, when you admit that you've made a mistake, when you admit that you need Jesus, because that's the point. We need to admit that we need Jesus. But believe that there's a place for you at the altar here. There's a place for you in the church family. That's actually what Jesus wants. He wants you to admit that you need Him. Because when you come to Him, you'll find Him waiting with open arms.